We got to get really quick. I know, David, you wanted to say one more thing, but we got to get to some sound. Okay, let's run through some sound. So first, let's start from the bottom and go to the top, and then let's start with Andrew Yang. So I just want to say, but when I set this clip up, this is real. I mean, first of all, Andrew Yang is all sorts of frustrating to me, and we will tee off on him more broadly and get a bunch of whiny comments about it. But I want to say that what is really starting to disturb me is that in a totally non-identitarian way, and certainly, there is a certain type of woke discourse that Andrew Yang is responding to, which I think, in fact, people like Sanders do it just by centering mass class struggle across all lines or answering. But there is like some sort of like, the dumb take on Twitter, like, oh, I don't want to hear about the opioid crisis, or, if I see a homeless white person, I spit on them because they're white and they're homeless. How ridiculous. Some very bad and toxic and economically illiterate and, stupid, horrible takes. So when Andrew Yang says, like, we should care about a bus driver a truck driver in Wisconsin, I'm like, 100%, along with everybody else who's working. But then he does do these things like randomly mention the white birth rate. Why? In fact, I would say if your answer to not wanting to center, if you want to just center economics, then why are you concerned about anybody's birth rate, right? Like, very weird stuff. And so there's this, and unnecessary stuff. So here's this clip with Mehdi Hassan in his podcast. I want to be really clear, and then we'll tee off on it, that from listening to this whole show, I don't think that – I think Andrew Yang is dog whistling, but I don't read that that's his intention. Although even in this clip, what he's doing here is in and of itself ludicrous, absurd, and dangerous, but he's also undermining those of us who actually do have to come into the discourse sometimes and say, wait a second, you're actually erasing a huge amount of human suffering and important politics because of your like performativity and, God forbid, political strategy. This is a disaster. Check him out on Mehdi Hassan on Deconstructed.
I'm wondering what it is that attracts neo-Nazis to your campaign. You're a progressive Democrat.
So I believe that the problem that the truck driver is facing and the problem the neo-Nazi is facing, it's a disintegrating way of life. I mean, like, obviously their vision of the future is nothing we want.
Sorry, a neo-Nazi's way of life is disintegrating. What do you mean by that?
Well, they look up, and this is just me projecting because I don't know what the heck goes through other people's minds. But if they looked up and they said, hey, Donald Trump's the answer, and they're like, whoa, wait, Donald Trump's not necessarily the answer.
I think he just missed. He just bungled something.
How could you? No, Bhaskar, let's be a little tough here. How could you, even if you had to make a very specific point, including points that will get people to jump on you, like, hey, you know what? There were some people who voted for Donald Trump who subjected to his scam and believed his promises. We need to migrate them back through an economic argument. There are some people like that, and they're very, very important geographically. Even if you're making that argument, why would you, like, if I'm concerned about accurately representing and of course, in his mind, it's all about the robots, which I guess we can get to in a second. But if I'm like, hey, this poor guy, like, there's opioids and a robot's about to take his job and fuck his wife, would I compare him to a like, what is the thought process there by which you can't just say, well, first of all, Richard Spencer obviously is not some suffering worker. He's a scumbag trust fund baby promoting Nazism, so I disavow him, or a white ethno-state. And now here's my real concerns.
Because he's not actually a progressive. It's this post-ideological kind of thing. And I think he was trying to express this vague post-ideological thing, and he stumbled into saying something racist by accident.
Well,
which is...
Well, I mean,
but
I also think the thing is with Yang, too, is that, so yes, like, let's not take him at the worst cynical version that he's actually trying to pander to Nazis and like racists. if you listen to that interview and you listen to Yang talk about racism in the United States, it's very clear that he thinks that like working class people across the country are all Nazis. And basically that's what he means when he's talking about, these people are seeing their way of life, go bad. And that is even like, that's like so offensive to me as well.
Explain what you mean by that. He thinks that most people across the country
So when he
share...
says, like, he talks about a truck driver and he melds that with a neo-Nazi.
Well, that's my problem.
Well, he was prompted to say neo-Nazi by the question. That's one thing, because I saw that quote and I was just like, and I didn't actually hear the clip, and it wasn't... In other words, like, I think it does matter the fact that, like, the word neo-Nazi was mentioned before, and he's, like, clearly an inexperienced politician and not a particularly smart guy. And he's asked this question. True. He's panicking.
I was about to say, you'll get all of the pro-Yang comments in the video, but they just plummeted.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Even it shouldn't be that difficult to say, Mehdi, I cannot tell you why some group would cynically come onto my message. How he could even say, look, there's some people that might not necessarily have as progressive attitude as you or I, but I don't consider them to be Nazis. They're not Nazis. Well, and I want to talk about their concerns. There's a million ways he could have done that without saying a truck driver and a neo-Nazi. Their lifestyles are both being undermined. That's an immoral, insane and reckless comment.
Yeah, I'm still fixated on the guy who's afraid that the robot's going to take his job and fuck his wife.
Actually, there will be jobs creating the wife fucking robots. I don't get the.
I gotta figure out. Yeah, they'll be disassembled in China.
If you've ever seen the old Mr. Show skit, The Racist in the Year 3000, the guy sitting at the bar is like, my daddy always told me not to trust a man who was made out of gas. Not you, Gleep Glop. You're one of the good ones.
Actually, maybe that is. Can we do the Andrew Yang impression now? Or I can't. Almost there, where it's just like, what their concern is that everyone's saying that they're racist. But what they're really, because what's going to happen in 2025 when Uber creates the robots that will fuck these guys' wives? That's going to create a whole other level of problems in the Midwest, and I'm concerned that we're not thinking strategically here. Another huge problem with Andrew Yang, just to put on the table before you guys jump on it, we'll get off of it though. But especially if you're a fan, and listen to this whole Mehdi Hassan interview, because that there's a reason they clipped it, and I do think that's very disturbing and hugely undermining for those of us who actually do want to assert class politics. But the other incredible thing is this move he does between, like, it's all robots and direct crash transfer and put CEOs in jail if they commit if they need a bailout, and then on the other hand, like, oh, I don't think a wealth tax is very realistic. Yeah. So, and if you follow the trajectory of all of his thought patterns, it will go to, well, I mean, if you do a wealth tax, the wealthy people will just sequester their wealth. So you can't really figure that out. That you just have to deal with. Robots taking all of our jobs and having some type of like direct cash transfer, that we can figure out. But all of the rules of capitalism, all of the basic power disparities, they're locked in place. And and that's one of the reasons I find people's interest in it. I mean, it's really, it's frustrating because it's obviously a lot of people who aren't that informed kind of jumping on a sci-fi thing. But it's also like, it really shows how much work capital has done to really depress people's sense of possibility.
It's this kind of Blade Runner plus safety net future where it's like we're gonna live in this crazy unequal world. It's like San Francisco but sped up 20, 30 years in the future with probably the authoritarian government structure of Singapore.
Right.
But we're gonna make sure that you at least have some money that you could buy your shitty space food.
Exactly. I mean, that's right. It's like, what really concerns me, Mehdi, is that in 2032, then that's when the robot algorithm will be able to not only, I mean, think about it when a blue-collar guy's wife, but also his sister is having sex with a robot. And those are the kind of conversations that we're going to need to have for the future.
Well, and also the how he gets caught up in what his idea of what's possible is his main thing, the UBI, the Yang bucks, which is like $1,000 for anybody, unless
you get social or disability payments or food stamps or different programs like that. So it's not even universal, and it's not universal because he says we need to do something about like being able to pay for it.
And to be really clear, my understanding is that it's an opt-in, opt-out, right? Yeah. So in other words, you can, and that's so, and I don't think it's intentional, but that reminds me of what predator landlords do in this city, which is like you can go to somebody who is actually sitting on like an incredible apartment deal. Like they have a rent-controlled apartment in some nice neighborhood in Brooklyn, which they can actually humanly afford. A completely unheard of thing in today's world. But they're also broke because either they're a pensioner or they're underemployed, whatever. And so a landlord, and there are deals like this, can go and basically say like, I'll give you $5,000 or $10,000, which is, relative to a rent-stabilized apartment in New York is nothing. I mean, it is literally the functional. I'm not saying it's not a real amount of money, but relative to housing security in this city, that is nothing. And yet people need to take it in some instances because they literally need to take it because they have no money. And to me, that just seems like the policy equivalent. Like if you're relying on disabilities, food stamps, and other vital services just to survive, contrary to popular belief about how generous these things are, you might be exactly the type of person who can be hustled into what ends up being a loss for you because you literally need cash to buy groceries. So I just find the whole setup so cynical.
Even in a sort of regular scenario, like the average disability payment is $1,200 a month or thereabouts. So they always take that, right? Like say that's for their handicapped transportation or whatever. So let's say this person also has non-disabled friends, right? And all their non-disabled friends are like, hey, let's go to the coast this weekend with our Yang bucks and go crazy. It's like, oh, sorry, I can't. I was paying for my wheelchair, so I'm just going to stay home. Like that's what that does every single month for those people.
Exactly
and also, what kind of sicko adds that caveat? It's just like, I have this, like, I'm a long shot fringe candidate. I have my 15 minute of shame, fame and also shame. But, let me just make sure that in my hypothetical vision of the future, disabled people don't get as much money as everyone else.
Well, we actually crunched numbers, looked at the numbers, and disabled people who I have a lot of respect for. My mom's friend was actually disabled, and but what we discovered is that disabled people, for whatever reason, and it might be because of a genetic precursor, they're a lot less concerned about having robots fuck their spouses. So we calculated it.
And let me ask you this: have you ever been afraid of a disabled Nazi? Probably not. So probably not worried about it.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, one thing you see the big black shirt, brown shirts, and they're big husky guys, and you're kind of scared, and you're like, oh whoa. But then you see some guy he's wheeling around saying, Hail Hitler, and it's like, okay, I wish you wouldn't say that, but you're not so scared. So that was the thinking behind that.
Yeah, I mean, if they, like, all right, so I mean, whatever. Like maybe it's just a matter of Andrew Yang being dumb and like he just kind of stumbled.
Or a secret libertarian plant.
But like if the Nazi thing is revealing, I think it's about what the point of the Yang Bucks are. That like it's not. It's not that he's actually concerned with this vague mass of working class truck drivers and neo-Nazis, as like people he actually identifies with and like wants to promote their interests, and he thinks that they can like win in any sense. It's that like really like it's not even like under the disguise of the cyberpunk, what it is like the late Roman Republic and the early Empire, where you had, because of consolidation of big farms, you had this big population of people who used to be small farmers who are like just hanging out in Rome being destitute.
Right.
And so like what like Augustus and his successors end up doing is they impose this bread ration, which is like, it's a pretty miserable existence, but like it's something that it's the kind of thing you come up with if you see these people not as like a historical actor that can like do things in its own interest that you might identify with, but you see them as like a social problem.
Rome was thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. We're talking about robots. I was informed that Marx was irrelevant because that was 150 years ago. You're talking about Rome?
Yeah, well,
dude, they didn't play video games.
No, I know, right?
They probably had less hungry children too in the city too, by the sound of it.
Yeah, totally. And that's, but I mean, like that's the thing. Like if you just see this as a social problem to be technocratically mathematically solved, right? You know, it's like, oh, all right, we'd feel bad if like all these people died, I guess. You know,
and
that,
also, as
that
Bhaskar said, they're also a threat.
that might cause some social chaos. So like, we'll have something that they can live on.
Do we actually think that he has tons of neo-Nazi supporters, or is the supporter? First of all, he doesn't have tons of supporters.
He doesn't
period.
have tons of supporters. Period.
Then he has some alt-right-ish curious kids who are on those channels, but also like some parts of his message. So they're mixing their symbols or whatever else. Then you have some like liberal journalists playing up the Nazi angle, because also part of it is like, a segment of the liberal elite in this country wants to believe that the primary threat is the Nazis. So while you're talking about Howard Schultz, there's Nazis everywhere.
Right.
When in fact, no, there are not Nazis everywhere. And in fact, the primary threat are capitalists. And the primary threats are like, you know, Diamond and Howard Schultz and yes, Donald Trump, but you know, it's just, you know, banal, normal people that you could have at your dinner table for like 15 minutes. You know, probably not more than that. But
I have some numbers on this from a Yang supporter who I was arguing with 2 hours ago.
Yes, please.
And he said, we did a poll on this in the Yang Facebook group, and only like 20% were right wing. By the way, right wing appeal should be a plus because Trump is dangerous. That's what this person said. So,
okay. But people are talking about that. But if you look at the numbers, and we were crunching some numbers, and as early as 2032, there's going to be a new self-generating robot that can perform oral sex on both men and women. So even if you're committed to a broader set of transgender rights, it's something you're going to really need to be worrying about. Because could you imagine if some guy, he's a milk truck driver, and first the robot takes his truck. Sorry. And then he's going down on his wife better than he ever could. So I think we need to get a lot more serious about long-term. That's it. By the way, that's another thing too. Is that one of his explanations of why breaking up tech monopolies wasn't really part of it was because you don't use services like Bing anyways. So we need to be realistic. Of course, not like.
Actually, fair enough.
Well, no, but
there's some natural monopolies there.
No, because you're literally no. If you no. That's not the point. If you took which part?
That it's a natural monopoly. That that like breaking it up is only going to go so far. What we need to do is socialize it.
Well, I agree with that in the long term, but that's not true because in a relative sense either. Because if you said Facebook can't own Instagram, like there's monopolies of the monopolies right now. No, so even by the terms of that's just a stupid argument. I mean, Bing is actually not Facebook the ultimate monopoly right now.
I mean, Facebook
it might be good that Facebook owns Instagram if Facebook was a state-run company, and that actually the integrations in the kind of, there might be certain things we like about it.
We get that. That's where yes, and we all get. Jesus Christ, you guys are
sorry. Are we sorry?
Those persnickety motherfuckers. Can we focus on Andrew? Jesus Christ. We're going to go do Joe Biden's segment in a minute. Do you guys have secret elements of the bankruptcy bill that were actually good for socialism that I should know about before we do this?
I'll brainstorm. I'll brainstorm some.
No, but like in all seriousness, yes. I do think that this exposes, like this is like something we're seeing in real time as like a real exposure of the limits of liberalism, because the sort of maximal liberal solution to concentrated corporate power is, I guess we're going to have to break them up. And that's running up against something that, sure, you could have YouTube not be owned by Google, and that would be better. But just one company owning YouTube is already insanely concentrated power, and we don't really have a good way of breaking up YouTube.
And you'd be better off working for Walmart than a bodega. Anyone who's actually seen labor practices in a bodega.
Dissing our Yemeni friends at our local bodegas. How dare you? But then what if people aren't thinking in their own self-interest? Because what if in 2050 a robot could actually write both of your books and fuck your wives? So maybe if we're thinking of more long terms.
Well, by
all right, I think we have to do it. Definitely have to do.
I'm going to be retired from both those things. I'm just taking it easy.
Well, that's the socialist answer. Like, absolutely. Could C-3PO write my books and deal with my wife? I could go have leisure time. That's socialism. Okay, all right, let's do it. I think we've finally done the Andrew Yang. I am so looking forward to pissing off so many people with that Andrew Yang impression because people,
Bring it on, boys.
Oh yeah, come on, come at us. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.